What is up, team? I am the Masters Math Teacher, and in this video we're going to learn about implied domains. So jump on board and let's get into it. So we learned earlier what a domain is. So a domain, which we learned earlier, is just the set of all x values. Okay. So we know that the domain is the set of all x values. What about the word implied? So when we think about the word implied, it just means that we can assume something based on our prior knowledge. So if I said to you, I have a fluffy dog, it's implied that that dog has fur. I haven't explicitly said that my dog has fur, but you can assume it based on your prior knowledge of what a dog is. So when talking about an implied domain, that's exactly what it is. So an implied domain, it's the domain we assume based on our knowledge of mathematics. So it's the assumed domain based on the laws of maths. Now this can also be called the maximal domain. So you can replace the word implied with maximal. And the reason we can do that is it's because it's the maximum possible domain if there was no restrictions on the graph. So let's see an example of this. Let's look at the graph y equals 1 over x. Now, if we draw that, we know that this has an asymptote here at x equals 0, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in a second, and a asymptote at y equals 0. So when we draw this, I'll pull out my blue. It's going to look like this. Mine's a little wide, but you get the idea. And like this. So when we're looking at this, why do we have the asymptote? Well, it's because we cannot divide by 0, right? So we cannot have 1 over 0. It just doesn't work. This doesn't exist. We can't divide by 0. Now, what's the lowest number we have? Well, it goes all the way to negative infinity. Our domain, the lowest value is negative infinity. Our biggest value is positive infinity. But we just explored that we cannot equal 0. So this has an implied domain of reals excluding 0. Okay, so we already knew that the domain was that based on some other experiences we've had with this graph. However, this is the implied domain because it didn't tell us what is the domain. This never said in the definition of the graph what the domain was, but it was implied that we cannot equal 0 because of our laws of fractions. We know that we can't have x equals 0. It just doesn't work. So let's look at another example of this. What about the y equals square root x graph? So y equals square root x. So again, let's graph this. We know that this has a vertex or a endpoint at 0, 0, and it goes like this. That's from our experience graphing the square root x graph before. So why do we have this vertex at 0, 0, or this endpoint at 0, 0? Well, based on our knowledge of square roots, we know we cannot have the square root of a negative number. So we cannot have square root negative. At least not in methods. Now you possibly will deal with square root negatives in a different course, but for methods, you always cannot have the square root of a negative number. So what this is saying is we're implying, or our implied domain here is just 0 to infinity, because we cannot have any negative numbers for that x value. We're implying that our domain is 0 to infinity. And of course, we're going to have a square bracket here because we can actually have the square root of 0. That's allowed. But as soon as it goes negative, it's not. So we're implying that the domain is from 0 to infinity. Okay, let's look at one more example. It's a bit more complex, but we're just going to go with y equals 1 over 3x plus 4 squared. Okay, so we know that the basic graph of this is a truncus. So we know that it's all the way up to negative infinity, and it's all the way up to positive infinity. However, we can also see that this here is a fraction. And what do we know about fractions? The denominator cannot equal 0. That's what we know about fractions. That's what's being implied because it's a fraction. So we know 3x plus 4 cannot equal 0. So let's figure out what this graph is implying our domain to be. So we just solve this for x. We take 4, 3x cannot equal negative 4, and divide by 3. So what we know is for this graph, x cannot equal negative 4 on 3. So what we can say is this is implied, or the implied domain equals all reals excluding this value of negative 4 on 3. So that's what implied domain is. It doesn't have to specify it in the question. It can just say, here's a graph, but you can imply what values you cannot have. So that's all there is to implied domains. Now go smash out some questions and practice this new knowledge. I'd wish you luck, but I know you don't need it. So go smash out some mathematics. And as always, if you liked the video, give it a like. If you didn't, give it a dislike, and let me know in the comments what I can do better. If you have a topic you want me to cover, let me know in the comments below.